Story. We're all grown-ups. No kids in the room. Okay. There was a man named Ulf, son of Bjalf and Halbera, daughter of Ulf the Fearless. She was sister of Halbjorn, half-giant in Hrapnista, and he the father of Ketla Heng. Ulf was a man so tall and strong that none could match him, and in his youth he roved the seas as a freebooter. In fellowship with him was one Kauri of Bardia, a man of renown for his strength and daring, and he was a berserker. Ulf and he had one common purpose, and they were the dearest of friends. So, welcome to the Sagas. That was a passage from Egil's Saga, one of the best known of all the Norse sagas, and it was set in the 9th century. And like most of the sagas, it was passed down orally through the generations until it was only eventually written down several centuries later. So who knows how much of it was true. Egil's Saga tells the story of his father, Ulfur, one of the first of the Norse settlers of Iceland. And the term berserker is, of course, pretty self-explanatory. They were ferocious warriors, often dressed in wolfskin, hence the origin of the term berserk. So, most of the sagas are, of course, fantastic oral histories of the Norse exploration or conquest of these seas that we are crossing and will be crossing over the next few days. But you wouldn't exactly call them peaceful bedtime stories. Instead, they plunge us into a world of vicious Viking blood feuds with verses like this. I have wielded a blood-stained sword and howling spear. The bird of carrion followed me. When the Vikings pressed forth, in fury we fought battles. Fire swept through men's homes, and we made bloody bodies slump dead by city gates. So it's all cheerful stuff. But let's follow these sagas as they recount the Viking adventures across the treacherous North Sea. Because I'd kind of like to start with a conversation about where we are and also what we are in terms of nation states. Because obviously here in Norway, we like to think of this slice of land as a nation called Norway and Sweden, and another nation called Iceland and Britain. But of course, I'm talking about a part of the eras where nation states didn't exist. So I'd like you to think of these people not as Norwegians or Danes or Scots, but essentially just tribes of seafaring people living in the thin, inhospitable coastal zones long before those nation states really ever existed. And as such, we can think of them just as fishers or farmers or seafarers, but essentially as warriors too, living in extended family groups that moved across water. So the idea of Norway or Iceland or Sweden would not have existed to them. They sailed from one shore to another. They were extraordinary seafarers, and they skirted the Arctic Ocean to the Faroes, where we'll be going past towards Shetland in a few days' time, and also to the country where my university is based, which is in Reykjavik, Háskóli Íslands. So as I said briefly, I won't bore you with my story, but I'm a social historian working on some of the strangest of species on our planet, human beings. And then, of course, Vikings went beyond that to Greenland and to the Americas. But it wasn't only the Vikings who were on the move across the seas, because life, of course, is complicated and stories are never binary. So if we go back over 1,000 years, even further back than the sagas, we discover other groups, including Arctic settlers from Britain and Ireland, such as people called the Papas. They were hermit monks, and they set off across the North Sea as well, even before the Norse settlers, in a bid in the early 9th century of the Christian era to find rather more peaceful lands than they had come from. And they could, at some point, hopefully settle in new lands, which they did discover, and there's some evidence to show that they settled in Shetland and the Orkneys, but also in Iceland too. And it was only after the Papas had settled Iceland that the Norse seafarers then arrived, from around 860 CE. So some then came back years later, the Norse, I mean. They stayed for a few weeks. Others then circumnavigated the island that would then become Iceland many centuries later. And yet others then chose to stay over winter, which you can imagine was no mean feat. Did they get there by accident? Did they get there by design? Some of those questions are answered in the sagas, but many of them are not. So we can trace some geological evidence of the first permanent Norse settlement to around 871 CE, thanks to the wonderfully named Bardabunga volcanic system, which is a wonderful word that I love to use. It's also part of the discovery of archaeological layers that first were discovered on top of the ice layer of ash and debris from the volcanic eruption. So we have further evidence of the period of early Norse settlement from that, but from also one of Iceland's most prominent authors and medieval chroniclers, Auri Thorglisson, Auri the Wise, who wrote the Book of Icelanders, Íslandabók, but we have only that from the 12th century. So again, how much of it is accurate is open to interpretation. But it does confirm that the Papa, who I mentioned came from Ireland, were already on the island when the Norse first arrived. And you can imagine how complicated and dangerous and frightening those journeys must have been across these seas to discover lands that they didn't necessarily know even existed. And in a modern twist to this story of the Íslandabók, it is still in existence today. I'm not sure if you've visited Iceland, but it's still something of an inheritance, if you like, of those ancestors. Those current descendants of the Norse tribes use the Íslandabók to check if they're related to each other before they start a relationship. So there are usual hazards, but there are even more hazards to finding the person that you think you want to be closer to in Iceland. And it's precisely these early forays across the North Sea and what happens directly afterwards that is described so poetically and colourful in these sagas. But what was their purpose? Well, if we start with the word saga, which comes from Old Norse saya, meaning to say, we get a clue about their oral storytelling origins, and we can also see the close parallels in etymology of words that remain closely connected between Old Norse and modern Icelandic and current English. The stories begin to be told over the years from those early settlements and follow the stories of those early Norse settler expeditions. But they were, as I said, only written down many centuries later. Sometimes they're about individuals, including juicy outlaw sagas such as the Gisli Saga or the Grettir Saga, whereas others tell the stories of whole valleys over hundreds of years, of families spreading out across several generations. Then there are the King Sagas that recount, not unsurprisingly, the tales of the rulers of Norway or Denmark as we know them today. And chivalric sagas too, the medieval Nordic equivalent of what we might call romances, And then there are legendary sagas about great heroes, a little bit like Arthurian legends, if you've ever read any of those in English folklore. So you can see the parallels across these islands, how this storytelling genre carries on in other closely related cultures. The king sagas were first written down by a 13th century chieftain and a poet with the fabulous name of Snorri Sturluson, who also wrote the extraordinary prose Edda. And then Edda, just to distinguish it from a saga, is meant to be entirely considered fictional, whereas a saga was intended to be a tale of real events. But as I say, and I frequently repeat, as you can imagine, it was only ever told orally over those centuries. So who knows how much of it was true. So think of them as a heady mix, let's say, of journalism and mainly fake news. An early version, let's say, also of unfact-checked social media or maybe a Netflix documentary. Entertaining, but essentially unreliable. They were ways of telling stories. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back a few steps, because I haven't really explained why the Norse were crossing these seas in the first place. Why were they invading lands from the British Isles all the way up to Iceland and taking those risks? It's possible, as I said, that those first settlers may not have had conquest in their mind. They may have been blown off course during the reign of the first fabled king of Norway, Harald Fairhair. But it's also hard to confirm any of this because the primary sources are sketchy and they often merge with the real stories of the sagas. And even Fairhair's existence has recently been called into doubt by some historians. So it's possible that he was also invented as part of an origin myth. Anyway, whoever and whatever real was or wasn't, we do know that the increasing numbers of Norse from these lands where we are at the moment start now to move further west, away from what we know as Norway now, to the islands of the Faroes, Shetland, Orkney, the British Isles, Ireland, and Iceland. Although, if you've ever been to Shetland or the Iceland or the Faroes, you'll also appreciate it wouldn't be your first place to try and settle and grow crops or raise a family. Anybody been to Iceland? Anybody been to the Faroes? Tough places, huh? Have you been in the winter? That's another whole ball game, as it is here too. Very difficult to imagine right now in 20 degrees Celsius on a day like this. But it may confirm this theory that some of these landings were accidental, as I said, that these new Nordic coastal communities were blown off course and ended up living in these new coastal zones in these barely survivable circumstances. And even then only, as I say, on a thin strip of more or less fertile land. And just to give you an idea, in Iceland, the light green areas are really the only habitable and agriculturally sustainable areas of the landmass. So, as we've seen on our visit through the fjords yesterday, these northern lands are stunning, but they are harsh and they are barren. And these landscapes comprise steep igneous cliffs and volcanic mountainsides and glaciers, and in the case of Iceland, of course, the additional enjoyment of living around volcanoes, particularly through those winter months, unlike the more fertile lowlands of England, which the Vikings had already invaded and conquered and occupied. But despite all this, these Viking expeditions continue, and we're not sure why, which is why the sagas are so important. The island of Iceland fills up relatively quickly, and you can see around these dates, 874, 865 in York. Even before that, in Ireland, the Norse Vikings were everywhere. But by 930, the Norwegians have pretty much settled Iceland, and most of that relatively good coastal strip that I showed you is now taken, and the toughest of the tribal leaders have more or less claimed the best real estate. So not much changes in the world. So this land grab by the rich and powerful was recorded in something called the Landnamabok, also written by our friend Auri Thorlisson, the Book of Settlement, essentially. So this is like a real estate journal, and this gives us some idea of those early Norse settlements. And like the Islandabok, it was also written by Auri, but it only really describes the land of those wealthy key players. And we don't know much about the less significant settlers and their smaller parcels of land, which is where the sagas come in. Not just as a great read, but also as a vital source of reference material for research, particularly to understand the journeys and the lives of these early Norse, which, of course, they describe in heroic and gory detail, including their valiant battles, not just of those rich and powerful, but also the common people, of their hopes and aspirations too. They're like journals, they're like diaries, and they include, inevitably, trolls and elves and other strange creatures. And those creatures are there mostly to protect them, to ward off evil spirits, and to build those communities in these harsh conditions. To most of us, obviously, 1,000 years later, elves conjure up very different ideas. This just gives you some idea of some of those areas in a more detailed map than the previous ones. But as I say, these lands did not exist as nation states, and they were really coastal dwellers who moved easily across this ocean. But in order to survive, in order to build their communities, they created stories. And some of those stories, as I say, included these trolls and the elves who didn't look like that. This is a very different image of an elf that we have conjured up about 1,000 years later, mostly drawn from Irish myth, but the Icelanders have a very different concept of what they call the Huldufolk, which are basically hidden people. Ulfur and the Huldufolk are not little pointy-eared green people. They are essentially guides or mentors who hand down advice, maybe in a similar way that we might think of some of our religious books. They were there to provide some idea of community rules as well, and inevitably that advice became enmeshed in mechanisms of community structure and social power hierarchies too, including, you might be interested to know, in some cases, useful warnings to poor, unsuspecting men of dangerously attractive women who could cause those foolish enough men who followed them to fall to their deaths. Similar in some ways to other ancient fables that we're maybe more familiar with, of sirens and mermaids and femme fatales. In other cases, the male hidden people were sent to advise mortal women how to behave. Because, of course, as we all know, if a mortal woman doesn't obey a male's instructions, all sorts of terrible things will occur. Anyway, these were the early social structures that also were embedded in some of those sagas. They served also, you could say, more important psychological role. They acted as a way of binding these frequently near starving, near freezing communities on the edge of this very inhospitable world, huddled, as you can imagine, in dark, dank turf houses that were often infested with bugs and the snow and wind howling outside. This was a time, of course, with incredibly high infant mortality. Disease was rampant. Poverty was, of course, pervasive. And the landscape and the climate, harsh, as I keep saying, unforgiving. The early settlers, therefore, escaped into a fantasy world, a parallel universe that was very close to their own, but different in a way. Almost, you could say, aspirational. Maybe we could compare them with soaps on TV today. They had similar characters, but they lived lives of conquest and adventure and bravery and abundance and prosperity and relative ease. We do know that the stories were told and retold within these family groups, as well as at village feasts in the evenings around winter fires, as I say, with the cold wind howling outside. And it was part of a tradition called Kvöldvaka, which was essentially the coming together of these communities around an evening meal or a fire or both. So there were ways of lifting spirits and understanding the world as well, but mostly they bound the group together through good old-fashioned storytelling. Everything, as I say, was better in the hidden world. Their sheep were fatter, their crops grew better, they were simply more bountiful than the world of mortal humans. And the sagas also helped come to terms with loss and grief. Many stories recount the abduction of mortal children by hidden people, which isn't the ghastly story you might think, because in many ways, to be abducted by the hidden folk meant that someone would bring them up well in wealthy homes and feed them. So the stories belie this really quite tragic reality, because not surprisingly, in such dangerous conditions, many mortal children often starved or died of cold or went missing. This is obviously a much more recent photograph, about a century ago, of a turf house. It gives you some idea of just how difficult the conditions must have been 1,000 years ago. So, with adults working up to 18 hours a day in the summer, trying to get the most out of the short farming season, younger children were left to their own devices, and older children would themselves be working, often alone, as they were sometimes put to work at the early age of 5. But whatever the cause, they frequently disappeared. And given the dangerous landscapes, it's not hard to imagine how they met with accidents, falling into rivers, off cliffs, or into deep lava crevices. So how does a parent grieve for a child or her children when there is no privacy, when you sleep and live and eat with up to 10 people in one tiny, dark room? Perhaps they tell themselves that, as I say, the child has gone to live with the Huldufolk, with the hidden people, where he or she will be better fed, better taken care of. So some of these sagas helped those early settlers to process that grief, while others told stories of valiant heroes, describing to some extent their ancestors, that diasporic movement from Norway, but in the noble and sometimes violent tradition of humankind. They had been seeking better resources, a better way of life, but in many cases had landed on a very difficult island. So, the movement across that Arctic Ocean, which I said was established by the Papas and embedded by the Norse settlers, now crosses even further west, crosses the North Atlantic, and of course the sagas tell their stories too. Some of those settlers, now that the land has been taken on the island of Iceland, move on to Greenland. And pretty much this now becomes the edge of survivability. You may have heard the story, I don't know if you have, that the name Greenland was coined as a kind of marketing scam. Have you heard that one? Okay, well that's the fault of this man, Eric the Red, who was another Norse settler who was outlawed from these lands, ended up in Iceland, was then outlawed in Iceland because of his murderous behavior, and ended up going further west to the island of Greenland, where he thought he could maybe make a life. But he needed his friends to come and help him, so he decided he'd give it a rather more cozy marketing name than it probably needed, and he called it Greenland. So he went back and he encouraged his own community to come with him to Greenland. Is that true? Who knows? Who knows whether any of this is true? But it's certainly told in many of the sagas, and especially the saga of Eric the Red. So, as I say, Eric then goes further west, and he ends up in the fjords of the Greenland coastline, and he's looking for somewhere habitable to settle or colonize. And his story is recounted in the story of Eric the Red and the Greenland sagas. So his merry bands settle or colonize or invade Greenland around 985, and as with previous settlers of Iceland from Norway, they may also have been blown off course. Who knows whether Eric the Red knew where he was heading? But on the other hand, you can understand this was a group of people who were very closely aligned with the sea. They brought all of that knowledge and culture with them from these shores. They found most of their food on the sea rather than on the land, and they were clearly not inexperienced navigators. They would have had all sorts of signs that would have helped them find land that they would have been aware of, including the paths of migratory birds and driftwood, for example. So this wave of Norse exploration to new lands continues, as I say, westwards, and continues beyond Greenland, thanks to this guy, Leif Erikson, Leif the Lucky, who was son of Eric the Red, and he ends up in a spot that he calls Hetluland, which is probably Baffin Island. But given its rocky terrain, he continues even further south along the coast to a greener, woodier place that he then calls Markland. And we believe that's modern Labrador, but again, according to the sagas, they keep heading down the coast to an area that he then names Finland. Not the Finland to the east of here, but Vinland. So you can see some of these travels. So all of this happens in the 10th century CE. The Norwegians end up in Iceland. They end up in the Faroes and Shetland, Ireland, and what becomes Britain. They end up in Greenland, and then they start working their way down the Labrador coast. So we believe that Leif Erikson's crew ventured along the modern Newfoundland and Maine coastlines as far as the Gulf of St. Lawrence to what he called Finland. And Vinland is the land where he could grow wine, supposedly. But we don't think that he stayed that long for reasons that I'll explain. It's in the Vinland sagas that we find most of the evidence of that exploration. So again, we have to take it with a big pinch of salt, how much of it is substantiated by primary evidence. But in 1960, in a very nice twist, a couple called Helga and Anna Stina, a Norwegian husband and wife team of archaeologists, were directed to a spot called Anse aux Meadows, where they found remains of 8 Norse huts. So this is really the first primary source to suggest that they did land on the continent of the Americas. It includes a forge, a carpentry workshop, and dwellings which have been carbon dated to around 1021 CE. But as there's no evidence of burials at the site, as I say, it's probably a settlement that only lasted about a decade, so they certainly didn't have had time to grow vines and make wine, but it was purely used probably for overwintering and some ship repair, and maybe as a springboard for going further south later on. But that probably didn't happen because we don't yet have any evidence to confirm that they went any further. So, as I say, the combination of current archaeological evidence combined with the saga suggests that the Vinland journeys were short-lived and that they weren't permanent settlements. The evidence also suggests that the Norse did some trading with indigenous Americans, who in the sagas are charmingly known as skraeling, which is a derogatory term for savages, and which Norse Greenlanders also applied to the Tula people in Greenland. But, not surprisingly, relations turned sour, which probably implies that the Norse settlers started trying their hand at looting and slavery, and with tensions building, they don't settle and they head home instead. So it's just worth noting that these voyages at this point did happen, but we don't have much more evidence than I've just described. In the meantime, though, something very significant was happening back at home, back in this region of the world. Because most of Europe had by now converted to Christianity. And Christianity is now imposed on the Norse colonies at a time when most of Europe had already either Christianized or was in the process of Christianizing. And you can attribute most of that to the Norwegian king Olaf Tryggvason in the 10th century, who orders the Norse colonies to convert. And he sends missionaries, but in good old-fashioned Viking style, this wasn't going to be a case of meetings with coffee and biscuits. This was religious conversion at the tip of a sword. But there's plenty of pushback from the colonies, with the settlers continuing to insist on believing in their pagan gods. And a newly converted Christian fisherman, let's say in Iceland or the Faroes or in Shetland, might continue to pray to Thor or Odin while out at sea, let's say, and then maybe to Christ when back on land. It was a hybrid of religious beliefs which went on for many centuries, which was tolerated to some extent by the new church, maybe because they didn't have much choice, and maybe because it was the only way of bringing those communities into their flock. But they got to choose whichever god was handy to help them the most. And which also in turn explains why there were still plenty of stories of those trolls and elves and dragons, which even today persist in modern Icelandic culture and Norse culture and Norwegian culture, even in the idea of the Trollfjord. And I think one of us took a photo of a rock in the Trollfjord that even looks like the face of a troll. So those concepts continue. They're still part of the culture of modern-day Nordic communities. So as I say, continuing these pagan beliefs and rituals is also a kind of an act of resistance against the new and unwelcome religion being imposed by the independent-minded colonies that were growing to be their own nations gradually. And they saw this area from which they came as increasingly oppressive. They saw the Norwegian kings as less their ancestors and more their colonizers and their unwelcome visitors. The Norwegian crown's interference and control is increasingly resented, and it becomes the perfect jumping off point for these newly independent, like-minded communities to define themselves in direct opposition. Something I suspect that our American friends can identify with. In fact, the imposition of this unwelcome foreign interference on local culture is one of the reasons why Snorri Snorrason wrote the prose Edda that I mentioned before, because it is essentially a handbook written 2 or 3 centuries after the first settlement to encourage authors not to forget their pagan origins and their pagan gods as Christianity became the default faith in those lands. Similarly, another key text from the 13th century, which was actually lost but then found again, was the Codex Regius, which was a unique collection of poems of the pagan gods and the heroes, and it was called the Poetic Edda. So briefly then, just to summarize, the sagas contain these universal themes that we can probably still identify in our own cultures. Many of the similarities of the stories that crop up in other cultural works that we're maybe more familiar with. Just as an example, there's the Nibelungenlied, Wagner's Ring Cycle, and right up to date, in more contemporary terms, we still come across pagan gods in many Marvel movies and comics. So we're still, to some extent, connected with these cultures in our storytelling too. But you may just ask, how were such violent tales happily told to family groups over a fire in the evening in those huts? I guess you could say, for instance, Njal's saga was a good example. It describes the deaths of 100 people. It's hardly the kind of story to tuck your children up to bed with. But just think of them, I guess, in the same way as the gripping stories of those Marvel movies, or scary ghost stories that we like to tell older kids, or maybe the way we like to scare ourselves at theme parks, or some of our favorite scary movies. I guess despite all the violence and strangeness, they're just quite domestic in many ways. Many of them are long accounts of just bitter family feuds and celebrity gossip about who did what to whom, proving that in the end, probably nothing much in the world changes. In a way, I guess that's what makes them still interesting to read today, because they are mostly just tales of fisher folk and farmers and common people trying to make their way in the world. And as such, they are a fabulous documentary account of this world and what happened as they spread out across the ocean, which we are making our way over right now. So if you'd like to have a go at reading a saga, I would recommend the sagas of Gisli and Grettir and Hort. Beautiful character studies of individuals. They're pretty easygoing, they're kind of fun. They get gory in places. But then there are also the Vinland sagas of that early settlement that only lasted maybe a decade in the northern elements of the American continent. And it was a wild ride described very vividly across those oceans. It's all there, it's all told in these great sagas. There are plenty of dragons, plenty of trolls, plenty of elves, I promise, and plenty more besides. But hopefully, anyway, that's inspired you to find out a little bit more about the scary stories of the Norse sagas. But I suggest you might not want to read them before you go to bed. Sleep well tonight, folks. Thank you very much.